My name is Victoria Grant. I am part of the 2017 cohort of the Huang Fellows, and today we'll be having our panel on hacking evolution. So, Mary Shelley lived in a time of great discovery and surrounded herself with the intellectuals of her time. Her peers' inventions allowed her to directly witness abilities of humans to altering the environment, which allowed her to explore these things of human alteration of the environment in her renowned novel, Frankenstein, which we are talking about today. Her protagonist, Victor Frankenstein, discovered the key to life, and later was forced to face the repercussions of his discovery. Frankenstein's creature leads him on a journey to understanding the consequences of human change on the environment, and today, 200 years later, we are still exploring those themes in this modern society. In an age of new technologies like genetic engineering, cloning, and gene drives, we still ask ourselves, when do we go too far in improving our natural world? Hacking Evolution will explore the theme of nature regarding Frankenstein, and today our panelists, Dr. Michael Lynch, Dr. Stuart Pimm, and Dr. Alexa Sutton-Lawrence will discuss how the concerns of Victor Frankenstein still relate to our society today. So if you all could briefly introduce yourselves and give any introductory remarks and start off our panel today.
Sure. All right. So I am Alexandra Sutton-Lawrence, and I am the director of the Science Policy Tracking Program here at Duke. I also finished my PhD here in the Nicholas School of the Environment in December.
I have a microphone.
Oh.
I'm Stuart Pimm. I'm the Doris Duke Chair of Conservation at the Nicholas School. I may or may not have been Alexandra's nature professor.
Mike Lynch. I'm faculty in biomedical engineering and chemistry. I work in engineering microbial species and bacteria and yeast to make useful things, so chemicals, fuels, therapeutics.
And would any of you like to make any introductory remarks?
Okay, I would. In Derby Museum, Derby is the county seat of Derbyshire, which is the county in England where I grew up, there is a painting by Joseph Wright from 1766 or thereabouts. It's quite an extraordinary painting. It's called the Orrery. It's of a professor who looks vaguely like me, especially when my hair gets long. There's a young woman at the bottom left-hand corner of the painting that looks absolutely identical to my wife. And it is a professor explaining the universe, they then knew it, to a group of students, one of whom looks absolutely bewildered. I sort of sympathize with it. I have students who look like that when I lecture. And it is a time and a place which is enormously important to our discussion, because this is the time and the place where the Industrial Revolution was born. The first ever factory, Arkwright's Mill, is a few miles north of the Derby Museum. What this painting brilliantly shows, like a lot of other Joseph Wright's work, is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's the time when people were assembling on moonlit nights at the Lunar Society to discuss all sorts of new ideas. And there was a good reason why people in the provinces were developing these ideas. Because if you had good ideas, you couldn't live in London. Because if you lived in London, you had to sort of follow the party line and be Anglican and all the rest of it. So all the clever people grew up in places like Derbyshire and the North Midlands. You fast forward a couple of generations, and this is where the followers of the mythical Captain Ludd, the Luddites were, and they were breaking mills. And they were breaking mills because of really two reasons. One of them was that there was this sense that putting people out of work was not a good thing. But there was also a sense that the mills were producing really shoddy workmanship. And these were craftsmen, and they objected to the fact that their craft, what they knew and what they knew how to do well, was being abused. And of course, Frankenstein was written into that era. It was, a generation after this unlimited enthusiasm of technological development, and Frankenstein said, look, there are some dangers to science. And the debate that tends to follow is that we always look at whether, there are bad things that science can do. And I think that misses the other thing that the Luddites were concerned about at exactly the same time that Frankenstein was being written. And that is that there might have been other alternatives, there might have been better paths. And what concerns me now in this age is what I call the technological enthusiasts. People who feel that the solution to our problems is going to be technology. And it's embodied by the breakaway or the breakthrough or something like that institute with Stuart Brand and his equally hapless wife, Ryan Fellon, who believe to solve all the world's problems with technology, including, species go extinct, don't worry, we can bring them back. There are other parts of this technological optimism. One of them is people say, oh, engineers, we're the heroes, we can solve global change, we can store carbon dioxide underground. A couple of years ago, there was a huge announcement of storing carbon dioxide in Iceland. The amount of carbon dioxide sequestered was less than my organization, Saving Species, www.savingspecies.org, all donations acceptable and tax deductible. It was more, we sequestered more carbon dioxide than they do in about 3 days by planting trees. And I think the piece of the debate that's often missed is not whether sort of science is good or bad, it's clearly both, but whether we are being seduced by people who embody this view of technological optimism and fail to look at whether there are better solutions to solving our problems.
Thank you for those remarks. And that actually is a perfect segue into starting our panel. Because obviously today, in the age of technology and great advancement, one of the problems or complaints people have is there's nothing natural anymore. Everything's technological, everything's manufactured, nothing's real. And we see that today in our natural environment, with medicine, just about everywhere, even parents complaining about their kids not going outside. So to start off the panel, I'd like to start with probably the hardest question in this debate and discussion, or I should say, is how do we define natural and nature in today's modern society when there are things so manufactured, so controlled, even debates on are the last wild places truly wild?
Go for it.
Sure. So, in thinking about wildness, wilderness, what is not wild, what is manufactured, etc., I think that it is important not to see things with these bright lines of distinction that this thing is fake, this thing is real, this thing is wild, this thing is in some way tamed or broken or in some way diminished from its wildness. But rather that there is a spectrum of existence and that along that spectrum are a huge amount of things that are touched and changed by human presence. And when we get too beholden to ideas of a pristine wilderness, we are really buying into a mythology that does two things. One, it puts an artificial separation between humans and the environments that they occupy, because we change environments. That's part of what a lot of species do. And two, it isolates in a way that isn't necessarily useful for the ultimate goals of conservation and preservation. And so it creates a psychological distinction between these spaces that humans have touched or are perceived to have touched or changed or broken in some way, and these spaces that are protected or still good or perfect, etc., when that is an artificial separation that doesn't really exist. And so I think it distracts from actually answering questions about how we preserve the experience of man and nature.
Unless this one works, which maybe it doesn't. So I would agree. I think how you define natural is really arbitrary. And as being someone who actually commercializes products in the past that are made with synthetic biology or engineered systems, I think it's actually more important to think about how society is marketing these terms. Right? So, I mean, I agree there's no distinction between natural and pristine or man-made. Really, at this point, we've been manipulating our environment since the beginning. But there's a lot out there now in what products you buy, if they're natural or not, or GMO or not GMO, or organic. And that's all about making money for the people who are selling it, for the most part. I would think the actual differences that you see in most of those processes, whether they're defining natural or not, are really not that important. I mean, there are some ways of making products that are more sustainable, more conservationist than others. But the terms are highly sort of commoditized at this point. So I think you have to be careful, not just with how you define it, but how people around you define it when they're actually trying to use that to make a point, or for political gain, or for money.
The Nature Conservancy claims to be the largest conservation group in the world. And until recently, it had a science director who wrote a scathing critique of the field of conservation by saying that conservation professionals believe in pristine landscapes. Peter Kariba met a very unfortunate end. He ended up having a debate, and that would have been okay, but the head of the Nature Conservancy thought it would be a good idea to bring along a reporter from the New Yorker, and Peter Kariba's tenure at the Nature Conservancy was ended about 6 months later, because on the other side I said that Peter Kariba should go. And so many people think that my fingerprints are all over the dagger that did him in, to which I say, Your Honour, guilty as charged. The fact is, Peter Kariba's notion that we in the conservation profession think that there are pristine landscapes is an absolute and total fraud. Nobody has ever said such a thing. You can go to Google Scholar and do a search, and professionals don't use that. Even parts of the middle of the Amazon are full of people. The Arctic is full of people. There are no such things as pristine landscapes. So do we know what's natural and do we know what's not? Yes. So when you're hearing people sort of suggesting that we still believe in these sort of pristine, untouched landscapes, that's a deliberate fabrication, and people who do that deserve to meet me in a debate.
So everyone here agrees that there has been alteration in the environment, and humans make an impact no matter what they do, even if they try to keep it untouched and pristine. But the further, Dr. Lynch, you brought up a good point that there are products and there's things made and there's things protected in natural spaces, but then there's also things some people consider improved, like making better crops and whatnot. And so the next question I have is, what role do humans have in alteration, and what do we determine is too far?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, I think, I'm not going to answer that question about what's too far. It's not for me to decide. I think that the problem that I always see is that people are not aligned, as a non-aligned society, as what the goals are. What the goals are for technology, what are we trying to accomplish, right? So we have this, we have to support, we're pretty privileged, almost everyone in this room, sort of a first world problem, right, that we have, that we can talk about this sort of thing. So if you think about trying to get everyone in the world to the same quality of life that we have here, right, what would that take? There's a lot of things that have to happen. Technology development, the way that we live in the States is not necessarily the most sustainable. It has a large environmental impact. So you have to balance that with, I mean, I believe firmly that everyone deserves the same quality of life, right? But can you afford it as a society? And how do we leverage technology to accomplish those goals, right? Which are important goals to have. But there's also the other side of the other important goals to have are conservation and limiting our impact, right? And it's, the debate always is sort of who believes in the one goals are more important, who believes the other goals are more important, and what their perspectives are. And I think it's how do you balance those two sort of drives as a society really is where this debate has to end up. And it changes and it's cyclical.
I think you're going to ask us a question about GMOs. And I think that illustrates why I think we're framing this question the wrong way and why I made my introductory remarks. You can certainly have a debate about whether GMOs are good or bad and the limits of science. I think the much more dangerous and difficult question is to what extent we can say, oh, GMOs are going to fix the world food supply. They are not going to fix the world's food supply. They can make some extraordinary advances. Golden rice is one of them. And advances for entirely the right reasons. The person who developed that variant, I met him, he's a very compelling guy who's very concerned about malnutrition in developing countries. Altogether a good thing. The danger is for people to say, look, we can solve all our food problems with technology, including GMO, when the reality is we can't. We can't solve that problem. There are too many people living too well. We've got to address population. We've got to address consumption. Those are the things that matter. And if we hold this bright, shining light of technological optimism and say, it's, she'll be right, mate, it won't be. Remember who you are.
This is a safe environment.
She also knows where her office is.
So Stuart laughs because he knows that I'm going to disagree with at least part of what he said. So I'm gonna address your questions in reverse a little bit. How far is too far? I think is a question that I would also actually disagree that it's not for us to decide. I think it's for all of us to decide. I think that is a societal question that we have to ask ourselves. I think that is the purpose of setting frameworks for how we proceed with technological innovation, is that we decide and then redecide and then redecide how far is too far. And we come back, we push back when there's harm done, we go forward when there's no harm and clear missed benefit. Okay? So I think that that's an ongoing conversation and not something that can be immediately and specifically answered to one, distilled down to one concept. It's a moving target, essentially. On the topic of GMOs and their relation, I think that, so when we talk about population and world food supply and things like that, the issue here is consumption and efficiency. The issues of consumption and efficiency are addressed through developing improved strains of agriculture, improved types of food, etc. Changing the density with which we can grow food and the number of people that a particular plot of land can feed is a significant part of solving that problem when we talk about getting everyone to the same standard of life and the same quality of life. I believe strongly that increased technological innovation helps us get closer to that goal, and that then helps us accomplish all of the other goals that we have in the space of sustainability, in the space of human health and environmentally friendly development, I guess you could say.
I think that's hopelessly naive. 30 years ago, molecular biologists met at a place called the Sutton-Lawrence, and they decided they were going to do all sorts of good things and not do this and not do that and not do something else. It was total rubbish. As soon as there were vast fortunes to be made for developing molecular approaches, they went ahead and made vast fortunes. So I think the idea that society can control people who want to make a lot of money and make it Alexandra's aspiration is a lovely one. I mean, I love it, I cherish it. It's a great idea. It's hopelessly naive. People are going to go out there and they're going to make money every which way they can, and we're not going to control them. There isn't going to be a society debate. The question is that direction going to solve the problems that we want to solve? And my feeling is it probably isn't. So even if we had that debate, it wouldn't get us to where we needed to go.
So I think that Stuart, eminently wise, is nonetheless being a little bit cynical about the opportunities.
That's because I'm older.
that technology can present. And I think that actually, I mean, if we look back a few years and we look at Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb and what people thought was going to happen in terms of global food supply and how many people we were going to be able to feed, a lot changed because of improved technology. And I don't think it has to be, just the last one, it doesn't have to be, it's not an either or all the time. It's not a zero-sum game where the second that we spend time investing in technology, that means that we're not, investing in women's education to reduce population growth rates. It doesn't mean that those things can't happen simultaneously.
I'm going to interject here real quick. I know you want to keep going.
You are so great.
I have to interject because this example that the audience is witnessing is perfect segue into another question, which is how do we engage in conversations about going too far and making decisions about this? Because as you can see, these topics tend to be hotly debated, and there's some individuals, or not everyone is as highly educated on the issues, like not everyone's a scientist or an expert and understands all the logistics and whatnot, and then some people get into some slippery slope mentalities where they think, oh, if we let you do this, you're going to go way too far and go way too down. I know Dr. Lynch with genetic work, that's a highly big concern for some people where they think if you change one thing, everything's going to be changed and all of a sudden people are going to have 6 arms or something. So, or be superhumans. That's obviously the huge idea of designer babies. So again, how do we engage in these conversations and make that bridge between science and society? Not like we're working in our labs where no one can tell what we're doing and society's out there being afraid of what we're doing, what we're cooking up.
I think that you hit the nail on the head. I think at least in my opinion, the best way to address this is education and accessible information. So how do you have a conversation that everyone can have the same conversation at the same time? And that's hard to do when you have people who are talking CRISPR and you have somebody who has knows nothing about CRISPR and is scared of the technology. I think there's a lot of real ethical concerns and there's a lot of real fear. I think I also agree with my colleague here that you can't stop things from happening. I think that's historically been shown that people are going to make money, they're going to experiment, whether the US or other countries put regulations in place doesn't mean it's not going to happen. So I think technology will advance, and so how do we prepare for it? How do we have a discussion about it? How do we try to get ahead of what may happen? I think that how do you best do that education? How do you best have that open conversation? I think it's really hard. I think that there's been studies recently that show it's not good for academics to try to teach non-academics things. It doesn't work. It comes off pedantic and paternalistic, things like that. So there's got to be some other ways that as a society on both sides we can come together and have a conversation about really the real issues. So there's a lot of misperception, there's a lot of miscommunication, there's a lot of misinformation. Go ahead, please.
So I think that's interesting. I think that certainly education is a part of it, but I think experience is a more important part of it, and it's something that I didn't touch on when we were in our previous question talking about population, food, equal access, et cetera, is the equity factor in that. And people become less afraid of things once they are experiencing, once they see the immediate benefit to their own lives, once they gain some familiarity with them. And one of the problems that I think that we have and will need to face as a world is rapidly advancing technology and significant inequality with how that technology is distributed and how many people have access to it. Because if you think of something like cars or elevators that were initially this really remote form of technology that only very wealthy people had access to, there was a lot of fear associated with using that technology. There was a lot of sort of public concern about what that technology could do. It could be running down people in the streets, etc. And then as that became a more widely used, more widely accessible type of technology, it just became normal, it became regular. People weren't scared. We were able to then have societal conversations on a more equal footing. But I think the access is actually an inescapable part of resolving this issue about having conversations, having genuine conversations.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, when I say education, it can be experiential education. It doesn't have to be sort of, I think just that's true. I would say that Facebook, the issue with Facebook is a good example of this, right? So you can sit back and say, this is awful what happened. But then if you ask people if they actually deleted their accounts, most of the younger people say no, because they've had the experience with it so long, they're not worried about it, right? There's been no repercussion, even though theoretically they can be, right? So I think people definitely are make and move based off of what they're comfortable with and what they know, both positive and negative, right? And perceived risks are less, are more tangible when you have experience with something.
I'd like to go back to the population bomb and what Paul and I think everybody realizes that he wrote it with his wife Anne, and I should say for full disclosure they are very dear friends of mine. A lot of people say, well look, they got it completely wrong. Well, there's a lot of things they didn't get wrong. One of the most dramatic chapters is the notion of an emergent disease coming out of Africa. And in a sense, they very, very much anticipated HIV and the kind of catastrophe that could come from epizootic diseases coming out of West Africa. They got that exactly right. But people say, look, you missed, the technological optimists were right. The green revolution came. Crops could be bred to be very receptive to nitrogen fertilizer. We were able to improve crop yields worldwide, and so the human population grew dramatically. Well, yes and no. The green revolution failed spectacularly in Africa. It sort of never took off there. And for a pretty good reason, by and large. And that is that African soils are, over most of the country and most of the continent, don't have any phosphorus in them. And if you don't have phosphorus, it doesn't matter how much nitrogen you put in the soil. So you look at where the African population is, it's a geological map. It maps out where volcanic activity is, because that's where phosphorus is. Now that's a bit sort of getting into the weeds. But the point was that the Green Revolution didn't solve our problems. It created a continuing humanitarian catastrophe across much of Africa. Africa still has huge growth rates. There are huge numbers of Christians moving north into the Sahel, huge numbers of Muslims moving south into the Sahel, massive mortality across the entire region. So when you begin to look at that, you think, just viewing this as being, isn't technology wonderful? The Green Revolution was fantastic. The Green Revolution just made matters a lot worse for a lot more people a lot later on. And we still have those kind of large-scale questions to answer and to handle. And my argument is, rather than looking at the limits of technology, because I think we're not going to be limiting technology, we need to be smart about looking at the consequences and how we're going to solve them.
Okay. So I think that this gets to the heart of some very fundamental questions about altering nature and what our responsibilities are on this planet. I would disagree that ongoing needs and ongoing challenges mean that we failed in the first step. I think it means that we have more work to do. And having more work to do does not preclude the value of the technological innovations that got you to the stage that you were at. To say, and I don't think it's a strong argument to say, well, now there's more people with more need, kind of great in the sense that that means that we saved a lot of lives in the beginning. And it means that we, yes, absolutely have a lot more work to do, but it demonstrates that we are capable of solving those challenges. We can do the work. And so I think that this is where maybe, again, the technological optimism comes in, that let's figure out how to do that work then. Let's answer the problem that's in front of us and move forward.
That was a great point made, because in debates, when you're engaging conversations with people, a lot of times on the opposing side of any argument, people point out your failures, point out your mishaps, the mistakes made. So continuing what you're saying with what you just previously said of our failures are the best place to keep going, some people take that as that's a sign that you're dabbling in something that you shouldn't be doing. You have no right in that. So how do we determine what our right is to making these alterations, to controlling, quote unquote, controlling things that, I don't think we all say we control genes or the environment, but just using that terminology, how do we make that distinction? What do we say it's okay to work towards this or alter this?
My rejoinder to that is that it's more subtle. Think about national policy. At the moment, we put enormous amount of subsidies into the farm industry, most of which goes to companies like Monsanto. Right? So we support them, we support big farmers, we sort of produce this high-tech, high agriculture production. What do we not do? We don't spend any money under this current administration on helping countries that have high birth rates control those birth rates, which is mostly a matter of educating women. And clearly our current president doesn't want his women to be educated, or else they would probably tell him to go to hell when he tries to pitch their asses. But the other side of that is that we are also not putting money into renewables, into solar, into wind. So, you know, you look at this and think, will GMO solve our problems? No, but coming up with sensible farm policies, you know, putting money into growing fruits and vegetables rather than soy, putting money into you know, you can imagine this as a series of policy alternatives, and that's what I'm suggesting. Putting money into Monsanto and GMO is not going to solve our long-term problems. It's technological optimism that's misplaced.
I don't think anyone disagrees that the Farm Bill is in need of significant reform. However, I think that, again, there's a little bit of a false idea that it's only one thing or the other. We don't have one national dollar to spend and one candy shop that we get to go to at the end of the year. We can work on multiple priorities at once, and I would posit that that really what we're talking about is maybe not so much a question of this or that, but really in what order should we do things. And that's maybe a more fruitful conversation in that it gets us closer to win-win solutions, which you know I love.
I think that I would add to that I think it's also complicated by the consumers, right? So I mean, I think one of the issues with the Farm Bill and corn and soy is that if you all of a sudden if you went to the grocery store and the average American is spending $6 for a box of cereal, it just wouldn't work, right? So there's an expectation of how cheap things are, and if you change that, you're going to create a lot of problems. So I think that there's that sort of societal responsibility that we have to take on as a society and say, are we willing to spend more for renewable energy or something that's more sustainably grown, et cetera? And those are decisions that have to be made by everybody, right? So I think that that's something that's hard to take out of the context of the larger population and sort of cultural norms. I think the question should be how do you direct policy to make that choice easier or to sort of support those choices for the average person, right? So that they don't have to make a choice between $6 and $3 or whatever it may be, so that the subsidies are sort of giving people the choices to vote with their money.
So I'm going to turn the question back on you. How do you direct policy to make these decisions and whatnot? Because, I mean, as I'm sure you know, we have trouble with policy on what do we regulate and how do we decide this is too far and this is where we can go. So how do we make policy to make sure everyone has this access and decisions?
So that's I think, really, really hard. I think there's a lot of so I answered the two parts. So it's really, really hard, right? And I think in the U.S. in particular, we cycle a lot, right? Our political system is just too oscillatory in terms of trying to get any consistent policy put in place that has any sort of length of time. So these things aren't going to happen within a 2-year cycle or a 4-year cycle. They're going to take longer. Having said that, I think that there are people sort of are worried about national politics and things like the Farm Bill and large agriculture happen at a national scale. But local policy you can manipulate with a longer footprint, whether it's your community or a state, more likely in the community, purchasing things that are local, things like that. So I think that there's more control there, and you can have sort of the local culture change faster than the national. There's just too many differences, I think, between people in California and the Midwest. I mean, there's just different cultures right across the U.S., and it's hard to say, let alone the world, right? And it's hard to say that we're going to have one solution that fits all. I think we have to be thinking about, this in this context works. This context it may be different, and these are the needs here, and how are we going to address this here?
This is getting a long way away from Frankenstein.
I think actually,
But bear with me. There is something we can do. And the reason that I preface my remarks with this technological optimism is that I do think that we as scientists have a responsibility to stand back and look at the absurd, preposterous, self-congratulatory claims that some scientific advance is going to solve the world's problems. That we can put a stop to. That we can argue about. We can say, look, this isn't going to solve things. We have very, very high mortality in this country. We have a survivorship rate that's lower than many countries in Europe. Modern medicine is not going to solve those problems. Eating better, eating all the fruits and vegetables that are not supported by the federal government, doing exercising, doing a lot of things like that is going to be more important than some fancy new drug, genetically engineered that's only going to affect the lives of a few people. Those kinds of things are things that we, as scientists, as professionals, we can tackle those issues and burst that overinflated bubble of unrepentant technological optimism.
going back to what you briefly stated, because I think as a panelist, you brought it up, how does this relate to Frankenstein? I'm sure the crowd is wondering. In Frankenstein, obviously the major key was Victor Frankenstein, a scientist, broke what he called natural law and brought something back to life. And I feel like the themes of that novel strongly parallel what we're discussing today, because obviously we're not bringing anything back to life, but the idea of protecting land and stopping species from going extinct, changing, altering microbes to better make medicine is what people determine as breaking natural law. It's unnatural. It's fearful. And after Victor Frankenstein created his creature, that's when he started thinking, wait, should I have done this? How far should I go? What should I do? So going back to our panel of going, like these questions of what's natural, how far do we go, where do we who takes responsibility for our actions as scientists and creating these different policies? Because Victor Frankenstein didn't think of that until his creature became what he determined a monster and went around killing people. That's when he stopped and thought to himself, wait, is this my fault? Do I take responsibility for this, or has this thing taken its own life? So with those regards, when we make those failures in science, or when they are success stories in theory, but they go on in their own way, do we take the responsibility only when it's a success story, or do we take it even the failure? Who is responsible for our work?
So I think that there's something really beautiful and romantic in the relationship between Dr. Frankenstein and his monster, but I think it's also very distant from the reality of science and the way that scientists work. Scientists don't work in isolation. And the suggestion that a scientist must take responsibility for their creation implies in some way that this is a creation that is born wholly out of their ideation and their mind. They've just gone off and isolated themselves in a lab on a mountaintop and made this thing. And that's not really how science works. There's a broader responsibility. Science takes place in a context of funding. Someone's giving you the money. Someone's supporting other research that has come before you, is supporting the research that you're doing. There are collaborators who are advising your direction, etc. The responsibility is shared broadly, I guess you could say, kind of by the entire scientific community, at least certainly within a subdiscipline. And I would say even more broadly by society itself. It's all of our responsibility what science does and what science creates. There's no one person whose fingerprints are on a train wreck or on a trophy.
I agree. We do agree occasionally. I'm old enough to have got to know many of the people who worked on the bomb. And the person I know best of all is Dick Garwin. Now, many people think that Edward Teller invented the H-bomb. Late in life, Edward Teller really admitted that it was his graduate student who came up with the idea of what they called the super, and that was Dick Garwin, and I served for 20 years on the board of the Union of Concerned Scientists with Dick. That's a pretty impressive piece of machinery to have invented. You know, what did Dick spend the rest of his life doing? Well, he worked on disarmament issues. But I think that whole story of what happened at Los Alamos and what happened thereafter, and talking to the physicists involved, mathematicians involved, tell us very, very clearly that we scientists really have almost no control over what happens when the politicians get hold of what we do. On the other hand, we do have a choice in terms of the science that we do. We do not have to be beholden to the people with the purse strings. You can say no, and you can, in a university environment, choose to work on issues that you think are really going to be important for society, rather than things that merely will personally enrich you.
Yeah, I think that I agree with all those comments. I think that there's a big disconnect, I think, with a lot of people in the public, we versus they, on how funding and support for research happens, right? I mean, the NIH does have a lot of, it's probably unique in the sense that there's investor-initiated research that's a significant portion. But if you look at the rest of research dollars that come into academic institutions or even companies, there are sort of focus areas, mandates that are, Department of Energy has some that dictates and drills down into what kind of projects they're going to fund, what their portfolio looks like. Same thing with the National Science Foundation, same thing with the Department of Defense, right? And those are all dictated by policy. So when you go and try to get money for a research project, right, it's not like you can just go knock on a door and say, I want to do this. It has to fit one of these needs, and even if it isn't to the NIH, it has to have a clear clinical need usually. Otherwise, it's not going to get funded. There is review, not only scientific review, but then there's also programmatic review. There are requirements from an ethical standpoint. So it's bigger than one person. I think the romanticism, as was mentioned, of one person in a lab that has somehow independently wealthy enough to fund an experiment to do this without any external checks and balances is really not the truth. And I think, and there is control that policymakers have, a lot of control, and I think is separated from voters, but in some sense there's a lot of control that actually is exerted at the policy level in terms of what gets funded. And I think that's a lot of missed or sort of misinterpreted by many people.
Going back to a word that you all individually use was choice and choose. How do you all choose what to work on in your separate fields, and how do you go about making that choice?
Go for it.
Sure. So a combination of factors. The most fundamental being, what do I feel drawn to work on? What do I care about? I guess is a different way of phrasing it. Some people say, what are you called to do? Some people say, what are you driven to do, etc. But a sense of particular interest in a particular issue and trying to move the needle on that. Whether that's conservation, whether that's creating better genetic strains of food, whatever. I think then you take that desire and you put it in the context of what's around you, what's immediately available. I have never joined a space research team because that was never something that was available to me, right? And so you are limited a bit by your environment, by what you can imagine, by what you can access, etc. And then within the confines of that, you then exert choice again of a menu of options that you find available to yourself. What do you select to work on? And that, I think, is a combination of desire and luck and randomness, and it's still sort of that underlying drive.
We pick projects that we think are important for society, and to hell with the funding. We're poorer than church mice. You know what? That has to be the way it is.
I think it's kind of, I wouldn't say I pick the direction for all our projects. I think that there's a lot of collaborators involved. I think there's sort of three requirements. You have to be excited about what you're doing, right? And it has to be exciting to whoever's going to work on it. So I'm not in the lab by myself doing something. There's students and postdocs, right? And they have to have sort of a vision of how their project is going to turn into something useful for them, independent of me. And then I think sort of those buckets have to be checked, so it has to be exciting, it has to be something that I use the word fundable, so that you can't, I mean, we can't maintain a large amount of research in our lab that doesn't have good support. And then you try to match that with what's exciting, what's going to have impact, and who's willing to fund it. And I think in my case, I really try to also focus on things that have translational potential. So I think that whether that's translation into spin-outs companies, into the clinic, whatever it may be, that there's tangible real world, not 50 years from now, but in our, what most of my students get excited about is the next 5 to 10 years, could you make an impact on something?
And then one final question before we're going to open it up to the audience and let them ask the questions. So we all want impact, and that's what the hope is. How do we determine what impact are we going for, and then how do we explain that impact to others? Because some people may not see the impact that you're envisioning of making.
So I think that your first question, what is the impact that we're going for, is so fundamental and often overlooked as people develop scientific questions and scientific careers, and particularly, I guess, in our field and conservation, et cetera. So what are you trying to do? What is a satisfactory outcome for you? I guess I'm sorry, I sort of lost you for a second there. You were asking how we answer that question?
Yeah.
Honestly, I think a lot of thought, a lot of study, and a lot of consideration goes into figuring out what it is that I'm actually trying to do, and then deciding whether what you're trying to do is to reach a specific outcome or to take a specific path. And I think that those things, maybe as much as I have railed against mutually exclusive presentations, those things can sometimes be mutually exclusive, and thinking about which is more important, which you prioritize, I think becomes a part of answering that conversation in the end.
I think a huge advantage of studying environmental sciences is it inevitably requires you to think about a larger picture. You're not sitting there and tweaking with a piece of a gene of a Escherichia coli. You are looking at a sort of an entire global view typically. And I think that's what drives what we do in our lab. We look at large-scale issues. We look at the way they're embedded in larger society issues, and I think it's appropriate to do that.
Yeah, I think. So I think how you describe. So the first question is how do you describe what your goals are? I think it's highly context dependent. Who you're talking to, right? If you're talking to someone who's giving you money in a company, it's very different than if you're talking to the public. So I think that this is the way it is, right? So I think that for us, I would say it's not necessarily mutually exclusive all the time in terms of the path versus the result. And sort of that's the fun part of being an academic. I think you can actually do both to some extent. I think I come from an industrial background, and in industry, it's all about the result. You can't take side trips to learn something new or to do something interesting. But I think, for me, I still have that industrial slant, and I think there's got to be a customer at the end of the day. And there is whether it's the person giving you the money for the funding, whether it's the potential patient who's looking for a treatment, whether it's society who wants this question answered, whatever it may be. There's somebody who wants something that you're doing, right? And what do they want? What would be valuable to the larger community, to these particular people specifically, and that dictates what the outcome should be, or what the final goal. Maybe you come along the way and get different outcomes, but that's how I think of what your outcome should be.
And then I think the second part of your question was how do you communicate the impact of what you're doing to people? And that is a huge question, and one that people spend entire careers on. Broadly, you speak to people in a way that they can understand. And I think that is fundamentally what underlies and drives all of effective communication, is whether that is through images or whether that is through community dialogue, whether that is through advertising, whether that is through traditional Western education, whether that is through innovative other forms of education. Whatever it is that gets people to understand and gets you to two people to come to a point of consilience is that's how you communicate your message. And I think getting too married to specific ways, it's got to be this way, people have to listen to a lecture so that they get it. People have to, witness my Senate testimony so that they understand why it's important is a little bit getting off course.
Okay. Well, thank you all again for being on the panel today, and if we could all give them a round of applause. I at least thought it was a very interesting discussion, so I hope all of you enjoyed it. And now I want to open the floor to questions, and we have one usually.
So when we talked about who controls science that is being developed, we kind of talked about the funding sources being and policy and funding and that. But what do you do about these billionaires who are setting up labs, studying brains, sending machines up to space? They are affecting science without funding, management, and who knows what's going on in some of those labs. That is not in this traditional mechanism that we're used to.
Well, I don't necessarily think that's any worse than what the federal government is doing. I probably prefer to pitch my idea to a billionaire than I would to the National Science Foundation. In fact, that's more or less what I do. Most of my money comes from rich people rather than the federal government. I think that's the practical reality. That's the fact that we, scientists, and we the general public, do not get to shape science policy. It's driven by a lot of other factors. Now, we can try and change that, but am I worried about what the billionaires do? Not particularly, even though they're funding, Ryan Fallon and, to do de-extinction. If they want to waste their money doing that, that's their damn fault, their money.
So I think that thinking about this particular situation, so I think that this is a broader societal question. The question that we have to ask ourselves is the enterprise of scientific discovery important enough that no single person should be able to hoard enough resources to singularly influence it? If the answer to that question, and we all agree the answer to that question is yes, then the first step is to put strong policies in place that prevent someone, no matter how many resources they have, from unduly influencing the process of scientific discovery. However, if the answer is maybe not really, maybe some individuals who are able to sort of collect this many resources may have unique contributions to the enterprise of science, then we have to let things progress as they are. I think that's a broader societal question that we should ask about how we want science to be conducted and what we think the costs will be in terms of risk of singular influence versus risk of loss of innovation versus kind of all of these other things. And so the answer is there are ways that we could control it. Do we want to? Will that actually get us the outcome that we want? Again, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to leap really far forward? Are we trying to all go together?
In your case, the umbrella you operate under is the Duke University umbrella. There are many of you out there, and there are many umbrellas and national umbrellas, and there are nations all over the world, and the international. In the case of Duke University, for example, does the university itself apply any sort of, not pressure, but standards or expectations that guide you, not control you perhaps, but guide you in your decisions as to what to pursue? Or are you in this environment more free, say, than if it was North Carolina State or University of North Carolina, a state institution?
Would you like to kick it off, Dr.
Sure. I mean, I think that there are, and I think it's most universities, whether it's NC State or Duke, I think that there's a lot of regulation on how you do what you do. So whether you're
I'm sorry, say that again.
So there's not as much, at least in my case, there aren't restrictions on, I want to pursue this area of research, right? That's a very independent faculty. You can decide what kind of stuff you want to pursue, assuming that you can get funding to do it. But there are regulations in different sources on how you actually can perform that research, and what checks and balances would be along the way, and when you're carrying it out, what you would have to do, which do influence, is it feasible? Is it going to get approved? So the concepts and sort of the path that you pick is very open, but there are a lot of regulatory.
You take those into consideration
Yeah.
when you're making a decision.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm at Duke because it's the best university. And it's the best university.
He's not lying. Are you getting paid to say that? Are you getting paid to say that?
It's the best university because, and that could be at other places, right? It's the best university because it's the easiest place to go from one school to the next. I mean, in the last few months I've taught in the law school and I've taught in the divinity school, and I'm not which school we're in now, but it's certainly not the Nicholas School. It's an extraordinarily flexible place to be able to work across disciplines. And that's why I'm here. That's why we're a top 10 university. Are there constraints? Yes, we have a dean of the graduate school who doesn't want Chinese students as PhD students. And that's open warfare as far as I'm concerned. But annoying though that might be, by and large I am not constrained by Duke. In fact, Duke facilitates me in an extraordinary way. It allows me to look at the kinds of questions that I want to do.
I would think that political constraints, politically driven constraints or influences would be less in a university like Duke or Vanderbilt or Stanford
the answer
than,
is
say,
yes.
the state universities.
But I was at a state university 20 years ago, and they didn't really trim my sails very much there either. The reality is you can speak out. Academics do have extraordinary flexibility to look at the problems that they want to investigate.
On the other hand, that makes it more difficult. Let's say there was a national policy that was influential in considering a university like Duke would be more free to, if it chose a particular program, to go its own way than to fit into a national policy.
Well, the national policy in this country is to not fund environmental research. It's a very, very hostile place to do environmental sciences. When I go to Europe, I go to China, or go to other places, it's, wow, my colleagues have funding. But that doesn't stop what I'm doing. And Duke certainly doesn't discourage that.
We're actually, unfortunately, out of time, and I don't know if the panelists would mind having questions. Yeah. I don't know if the panelists will have any time afterwards to talk to if anyone else had questions, but again, can we give them another round of applause?